Okay, so we have a bit of human drama now that the Gran Turismo World Series online component has started off. And Andrew, why don't you tell us exactly what's happening here?
Yeah, so this kind of came to our attention earlier this week. In effect, Polyphony Digital is really cracking down hard on some driving standards. Um, I mean, it's it's a complicated, it's a difficult situation. We've seen over the last 5 years that the online part has not necessarily always been the cleanest. I mean, obviously, when you get to the higher levels of drivers, they're expected to be better, and obviously they represent their nations and their manufacturers in the world finals if they get that far. Um, but we have seen some poor driving standards further down the field, and it looks like this is being come down on pretty hard, as we've seen several players losing their points for entire rounds for, I mean, what seem to be really, really small infractions on the track. The first one we saw was there's a young Italian driver called uh, Francesco Bertani, I think. I'm not familiar with him because he's like I think he's 17, so he's an up and coming young driver, and he had all of his points deleted for one of the rounds in the Toyota Gazoo Racing GT Cup for, I mean, I barely even know what for. Um, it's an incredibly minor incident right near the end of the race where there's four cars all vying for the same piece of road, and there's rubbing, yes, there's a little bit of contact, but he's lost all of his points, not just from that race, but for the whole round as a result of this small contact. And then since we learned about this, it's spread further into the Manufacturers' Cup, which has had the first two races already, with some big name drivers losing out. I mean, one of them was Nico Romero, who was on the podium for Genesis last year in the World Final. He lost all of his points from a race, again for something. I mean, it was so minor that you would brush it off completely. I mean, yes, okay, if you were on the receiving end of that, and I think it was Baptiste Beauvoir who he tapped, another long term finalist. They both stayed on track. The positions did swap, yes, it, but it seems so heavy handed. Um, on the flip side, it's incredibly welcome, but only if it's going to be applied to the 10, 20, 30,000 players across the board. Because all we've seen so far is it's applied to the top split, I suppose, and none of the other players are getting similar kinds of, I suppose, justice in the racing, where it seems that pretty much anything goes further down once the game's dealt with its the penalties it gives out automatically. Nothing else is done. In this, no penalties given out by the game, but it's been looked at. I mean, 11 days later, in the case of Bertani's Gazoo Racing race, 11 days later, he's had all of his points stripped for something the game didn't even judge to be worth it.
Yeah, and I think that's one reason that so many people have a problem with this, understandably. If you're trying to set an example here, which I understand, and as you
Yeah,
mentioned, driving standards and penalties have been controversial since the Gran Turismo World Series or World Tour even started. But if you really want to improve these standards and really enforce these rules, you need to do it quickly and consistently. I'm really
mm,
surprised. Think of all this. What surprised me the most is just how late these penalties were
yeah.
actually applied. That's doesn't really seem appropriate.
No, I mean we've seen over the course of the past day, we've seen a couple of similar penalties. I say penalties, punishments, I suppose, given out for drivers who are racing in round two of the Manufacturers' Cup, which was just on Saturday at Interlagos. So obviously it is getting quicker, but there seems to be some almost a knee-jerk reaction that's happened very suddenly. We don't know if there's been any warning previously given to the drivers, but a lot of the players are acting very surprised that this is the outcome. And of course, it's not actually helping anybody else because the players themselves are being disqualified for, I mean, minor infractions, and I mean, the nature of the way that the series calculates its points, the way it's run, the players behind aren't being moved up. So they're not gaining anything from these supposedly dirty players being disqualified from these rounds. Um, I, I see why they can't do it because of it's how it's calculated, and obviously players will, if they get a poor result in one race, they will go on to one of the other slots that happen afterwards. Because each race has, if you're in the GT1 league, each race has 3 possible entries. So if they get a poor result in the first one, they'll go back and they'll race again for the second and third ones. And they you know, if the punishment had been given out on the spot, they might not have done that. So obviously, this is something that can't really be addressed after the fact like this. Um, Again, I understand the need for cleanliness, especially amongst these top 16 drivers in each region who are going to be the representatives at the finals events. But it seems to have come from absolutely nowhere. It seems to be the most draconian punishments possibly imaginable without warning, and nobody else is really benefiting from it.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions, and where this came from, why. I don't think this is really a good way to start out the 2024
Yeah.
season. Normally, we have these sort of controversies at the live events where someone has made a rather egregious mistake.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit early in the season for this type of I guess, inconsistency or bad press to come to light. It's unfortunate to see. This is really something that I think if Polyphony wants this series to be taken very seriously, and obviously they do, they're spending a lot of money and resources and time on these live events. They're really going to have to take the penalties and the punishments, as you said, they're going to have to really figure out how to dial this in. But it's not easy. It's not
No,
really an easy thing
no.
to do.
And it has in effect come halfway through the season because we've already had the Nations Cup,
Yeah.
and a lot of the drivers on social media are posting videos of incidents that are very similar and even worse in some cases in the Nations Cup that happened in amongst these top split lobbies that have gone unpunished. So we've had 6 races in the Nations Cup where the expected standards have been in place, and then now we seem to have a completely different rule set with regards to what allowable contact is and isn't for the Manufacturers Cup. And I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, I know a lot of players they're somewhat cool on the idea of the format for this year's championship. And I think this has just only added fuel to the fire. There's a lot of people saying it's absurd, it's Mickey Mouse. Someone said it was a complete joke. One of the drivers said it's Pandora's box is now open. It's not left a good taste in the mouth.
No, and I think this isn't exclusively a Gran Turismo problem. I think
It is
sim
not.
racing in general really suffers from this because of the format of online racing itself. I mean, I think there's always going to be these types of controversies because it's not like Call of Duty or a first person shooter or Fortnite or something where you have a very clear set of rules and there's only so many things that you can do unethically, I guess,
Yeah.
in the world of the competition. But with racing, there's a lot of gray areas. There's people make honest mistakes. People bump into one another, and nothing happens sometimes, and other times it can be devastating for
Yeah.
one of the parties involved. I don't think this is something that is really going to be an easy thing to fix. You still need human intervention and human review for these types of things. But when, as you said, these incidents in particular we're talking about here were not things that the game picked up on. I think if you stick it within the game's parameters for what it considers to be bad behavior, then at least you have some degree of objectivity around the punishment. And it won't always get it right, but I mean, that's what we did with the GT Planet League that we hosted a few years ago. We said, well, it's not going to be pretty all the time. And sure enough, we did have a few incidents where the game issued penalties that were not fair, but at least it was code that was making
It,
the decisions, and nobody
it
could
was
accuse
fairly
us
unfair.
of any type of favoritism or
It
anything
was
like that.
objective in its unfairness. It was, you can't really complain. But racing is a non-contact sport. You're not supposed to hit other cars. The fact is that these things do happen when you've got people on opposite sides of a continent connecting over the internet. There's a limited amount of um, speed by which the game can process everything. You're going to see cars coming into contact with one another, even if they're not actually aware of it themselves. Um, so, but I say these incidents they've not been people coming from thousands of miles back, dive bombing and smashing straight through people. This has literally been door rubbing or just a little bit of a misjudgment where there's been a slight front rear tap and the car's lost 3 kilometers an hour. And it's resulted in a complete disqualification from the whole round, one of six.
Well, we'll just have to see. Things are certainly getting off to an interesting
Yeah.
start this season. I think the first live event in Montreal, I'm sure this will be a hot topic of discussion among
Yeah.
the competitors. But yeah, hopefully we'll get some more information on this. And I think that would be welcome for everybody, not
Yeah.
just the drivers, but the spectators as well.